I've always had a lot of energy. I've never cared too much for hanging out and getting drunk every night, which is what a lot of people did. I wasn't on the make. I was happy, and I wanted to make things. I wanted to do things. It was equally important to me to contribute as to write.
Hello and welcome to Artifacts, a living archive dedicated to preserving the first-person stories of queer, avant-garde, and underground culture, told by those who lived it. Today's episode is part of our series, Underground Press, the untold stories of literary rebellion and the figures who redefined the boundaries of literature and publishing. We hear from the vibrant Hettie Jones, who moved to the heart of 1950s Greenwich Village and married LeRoi Jones, later known as Amiri Baraka, and witnessed the Black arts movement from close up. A poet, editor, and memoirist, her work created bridges to many communities of resistance and renewal. This 2004 interview, recorded in Hettie Jones's apartment at 27 Cooper Square in New York's East Village, offers a rare window into the women of the beats, interracial partnership in a divided America, and the power of small press publishing.
I had one very, very important, I guess you would call it a religious experience, but I really don't know what to call it. I was 4 years old and my father was taking a picture of me, and I was standing with my back to the lake, it was in the summer, and looking into the sun, and I said, I can't open my eyes because the sun's in my eyes, and he said, just open your eyes for a minute. And I thought, all right, I'll open my eyes and then I'll go blind and it'll be his fault, right? So I opened my eyes, but instead of being blinded, there was a great darkness, and this appeared to me, and the way I articulated it was that I felt that I could do anything because inside me was a very large, a limitless, dark, and comforting space. And I used that space. I was 4. And I used that space whenever anything bothered me. I would consider it. The space took care of whatever emotional upset happened. Probably intellectually, I would have liked to have women who I could look at and admire. But also, even though I came from a loving household, there were no books there. So there was no intellectual guidance. There was no one with whom I could have a discussion about what is best to do. Gotten involved with people who were playing music, Dixieland music. But one of the guys in this Dixieland band had bought from a previous owner a magazine that had been in existence for people who collected old jazz records. And it was called The Record Changer. And he said, I need someone to work for me. I can only pay you $1 an hour, but come downtown, you'll like the village. That's what he said. Well, I had visited the village, of course, you know, I think when I was in college on vacations and stuff. But when I started to work down in the village every day, I said, okay, I'm saving up my shekels and I got to move, because also in the meanwhile, my girlfriend had stolen my boyfriend and whatever. You know how things happen when you're 20. By this time I was probably 22. So I moved downtown, I got my own apartment. I persuaded my father to bring a mattress that he and my mother were throwing out, but they would only give it to me if they put it on top of the car and drove it into the city under the cover of darkness, because they didn't want anyone to know that I was doing this. And then he stood at the foot of this, I guess it was a 5-floor walk up or 4 floors, something like that. And he just looked up at the stairwell and he said, "Ugh, why live like this?" But of course, anybody who had any smarts would know why you wanted to live like that. You wanted your independence. You wanted to be free. And the trouble was that everybody knew what you were going to do in your apartment, because they wanted to do it too, but they were constrained. Well, first of all, going on village-wise, what was going on in the village was that it was old and lovely and full of cobblestones and silence. McDougal Street hadn't yet become MacDougal Street. Just all the history seemed to be seeping up through. But what was going on were things that I hadn't ever imagined. Poetry readings. Now, they were just beginning to happen. They had started in San Francisco and were popular with Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and the City Lights Bookshop and other places. Other than Jack and Burroughs and Gregory Corso, a lot of people were younger, a lot of the newer writers. But Allen himself was always socially conscious. And plus, he was one of the world's best Jewish mothers. We would go to the Gaslight, and it was just wonderful fun. This place with all this dust on the wagon wheels. It was so funky and marvelous. And then we would sit in the coffee shops like the Rienzi and Cafe Reggio and, all of these wonderful little places. And then there was the Five Spot. The Five Spot. I started going there after LeRoi came to work, and Thelonious Monk was playing there, and Billie Holiday sang there. This was on Cooper Square, which was the new, they weren't even calling it the East Village, it was still the Lower East Side. It was deserted. Manufacturing had gone on in all the lofts on Broadway, in what is called NoHo now, and in Soho. But these places were dying because the mills had moved south for cheap labor. Everything was deserted at night around here, and it was very interesting and mysterious. But we met there all the other people who used to go to the Cedar Bar. And then we started to go there as well. And so we met Franz Klein, Willem de Kooning, Larry Rivers, and then the writers who had just come up from Black Mountain College, like Joel Oppenheimer. Then the New York writers like Kenneth Koch and Paul Blackburn. There was a mix of people from all the arts. And that was the biggest turn on, because you were not only in a little funnel of writers, but I loved the conversation at the Record Changer, into which we could all participate and we could all contribute. Nat Hentoff hung out there. Martin Williams, who was later the head of the Smithsonian Jazz, the Institute, I've forgotten what it's called. And other people like that who's, now you hear them on the radio.
How much black and white overlap was there around jazz at that point, either at the Record Changer or more generally?
Well, only Charlie Hayden, the white bassist who played with, and still plays, who played with Train. You know, there always have been white musicians who have played jazz and who are accepted simply because of their incredible musicianship, because it's very, very hard to play jazz. It's very hard to improvise. It's way harder than anybody thinks. That was always a rather prescribed area. But insofar as the audience, there were a few bohemian men and women who were beginning to populate the village area. Then, of course, people came slumming, but they came to see Monk. You know, when Monk had a gig, people would come from all over. You know, the general bohemia was still mainly white. The only black painter on the scene, other than the older men who had been in really more in the abstract expressionist movement. I'm thinking of people like Jack White, who's not so well known, but Ed Clark is someone who still paints today. But people like Romare Bearden I didn't meet until later, after I knew. And then there was one young man named Bob Thompson, who turned out to be a remarkable painter and who was in the midst of all that abstraction. You know, traditionally there was always one black person in the white avant-garde.
Yes.
There was, Jimmy Baldwin, you know. And we're talking long after the writers of the Harlem Renaissance have come and gone. What we came to call black culture didn't have that name. It was still waiting there, intact, to be acknowledged and included. So what we know today about it, and still there's precious little known about it, it wasn't in the general culture. You know, television at that time, you rarely ever saw a black face on television. Rarely. And then it was probably somebody's maid. The movies were the same way, you know?
Yeah.
I remember LeRoi saying that, like, every time a black person and a white person get together in the movies, somebody cries. And it's just so typical, you know? That's just about where it's at. When LeRoi Jones walked in there, you know, he was just this nice guy, and we started talking about Kafka, because I was reading America. And we never stopped talking until after we got married, and then how married people, they don't talk to each other anymore. I was the one who interviewed him. This guy walks in, and the funny part of it was the editor ducked out on me. He said, "Somebody's coming to be interviewed, and you're so good at this, and you're so personable, and blah, blah. I'm leaving, you do it." I said, "Oh, that's just wonderful. Thank you very much." So in comes this funny short guy with a widow's peak, and it didn't surprise me at all that he was a black guy who was applying for a job at a record magazine. Why not? And he saw me reading this America, and then we immediately started talking about Kafka and literature and this and that. And then the editor walked back in and said, "Oh, hello, and did you interview him?" And I hadn't. We had just been talking. Well, we were friends before we really became lovers, and that, I think, is one of the better ways to get to know somebody. He had a girlfriend, I was dating somebody else, and then it just happened, you know? Well, he was very smart. He was very funny. People were at a loss, asking me, "What does he mean, LeRoi? What does he mean he's saying, 'Oh, Damballa, murder my friends in their beds'?"
Choke my friends in their bedrooms with their drinks spilling, and restless for tilting hips or dark liver, lip-sucking splinters from the master's thigh. Black scream and chant scream and dull, unearthly hollering data, bilious what ugliness.
They were so outraged and so upset, more upset than angry. Maybe outrage is not really the best word to use there, because they really were more upset than angry. And I felt that I was being asked to answer for him, and I couldn't. But something had happened to me in the act of bearing black children. Something had happened to me to see much more than your average white girl. I couldn't hold LeRoi to me for that was one of the reasons I couldn't hold him to me and say, you're walking away from a marriage, you're walking away from a commitment, you're walking away from everything you said you believed in. I felt that the situation that black people faced in this country was so extreme and so their whole lives so unrealized, and they were so marginalized, that the prospect of that happening to my children filled me with a great dread. And especially since they were girls, I saw the difficulties that LeRoi's sister had in trying to establish a career. And I knew it would have to get worse before it got better. And I knew that if my personal happiness was on the line, that I was going to have to see that in terms of a larger good. But I couldn't explain that position to the people who were offended by his poem. They were bereft that he'd gone uptown. And I couldn't explain how I felt about it to them because my position was different. Anyway, he went to Cuba in, early on, 1960. And that was the same year that you could watch on television the lunch counter sit-ins. All of that began to weigh on him. He wrote that essay, Cuba Libre, but you couldn't help but look around and see what was going on down south. And then when Malcolm X started speaking, and everyone, and you know, I can't pretend to speak for young black men at the time, but what from my observation, all the young lions felt that this was someone who was speaking for Northern people as well as whatever Martin Luther King faced. This is not to say that King was not our hero as well. But when all the marching and everything resulted in nothing, and we're talking really, talking the early 60s, I think he got angry just like anybody would. And then what could have been the defining moment, I really don't know. There's a poem in which he said, all the things I never wanted came back for me to love them. Old social songs, racial songs, and then the poem goes on. I think after Malcolm died, he felt he could go to Harlem and be Malcolm, but that wasn't, you can't just walk in somewhere. You can't. LeRoi and I both knew that we had to get jobs. And so we were reading the paper one Sunday, the New York Times, and he said, hey, look, I had been hired at the Record Changer as the subscription manager. That was my title, though I did many other things as well. And there was an ad in the New York Times for a subscription manager for the Partisan Review. So LeRoi's reading, and he reads this out loud, and he says, Partisan Review wants a subscription manager. And I said, well, I'm a subscription manager. So I answered the ad, and I go there. I wasn't quite so funky maybe because I was going on a job interview, but I probably looked around 14 years old. And I got there, and the fact that I wasn't one of the New York Jewish intellectuals or anybody like that, or some little girl, the daughter of someone from the Upper West Side, William Phillips looked at me. He was a little dubious when I said I brought him my resume, and I said I'd been to Mary Washington College, and who knew Mary Washington College from a hole in the wall? He said, really looking down his nose at me, he said, and you knew the magazine. And of course I knew it because in the course of writing my honors thesis in college, I had run across work by Delmore Schwartz, who had been published in Partisan Review. And so I made that connection. And then also, LeRoi was dismissed from the Air Force for unclear reasons. He claimed that he was reading subversive literature, and so he was declared an undesirable, not dishonorable, but undesirable. And I said, well, to William Phillips, well, of course, a friend of mine was dismissed from the Air Force for reading it. And that seemed to satisfy him. He was thrilled with that information. And then when I started to work there, and they saw what a good worker I am, they then gave me more and more and more responsibility. They then trusted me to read the slush pile. And pretty soon, Philip Rov came one day, and he was this big bear of a man, and he put his arm very gently. He handed me a manuscript and said, copy edit this. And I said, well, how do you do it? He said, and then he put his arm around me and patted my shoulder, and he was very, very, very sweet. He said, just make it right and change it from English to American. I learned a great deal, and I was entrusted more and more with responsibility for actually running the magazine. I was the only employee for the longest time, and that satisfied me so, because I didn't have to deal with anyone else. I had all these back issues of the Partisan Review from 1930 whatever, when the year I was born, 34, on, and I just read through everything. And that's how I think I learned a lot more about literary history. I didn't, I was not a literary type of person. No books in the house. When I went to college, I was a drama and speech major. So I read every play in the English language, but I didn't read all the books that I needed to read for literary history. And
well, what an amazing education, just reading the Partisan Review.
I was so happy. And then there were review copies, and what the editors didn't cop for themselves, I used to take home. And then the ones we didn't want, we'd sell at the Strand. So it was a cushy job. I made $65 a week, which was a great step up. And then I remember I got a raise. By the time I left there, I was making $75 or $85 a week. It was a big deal. But I worked there for altogether 5 years. I gave birth to 2 children while I was working there, and they so kindly let me have unemployment insurance and then come back to work. So I always thought that there was some understanding on the part of those men. And the big important thing about being at the Partisan Review was that we had made friends, and this was not just me, but this was also Roy, with the distributor. All the little magazines shared the same distributor, Bernhard de Boer. And then LeRoi wrote an answer to an article by Norman Podhoretz in which Norman described the Beat Generation writers as nothing but, no different from the motorcycle hoods in their leather jackets who are running amok, sort of James Deanish kind of thing. Of course it had to be refuted, and when I brought in the letter that LeRoi had written, William Phillips said, hey, this guy's a writer. And so his estimation of me then increased because I was married to a writer. There came the sexism, and there came that whole, attitude about women. Why I never felt that condescension from LeRoi was, and a certain amount of respect, was not only because I had this job and people trusted me and everything, but in his family, all the women worked. Black families couldn't manage. We see that now in white families. We see that all over. But what black women have always worked. So I came into a family, even though my own family disowned me when I married, I came into a family in which women of achievement, there was a place for women of achievement, and it was not only accepted, it was kind of expected. Oh. So I felt right at home. And his mother and I, well, she was my mother. By that time, we had met Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, although I don't remember him very well, Gregory Corso, all of the Black Mountain people, but no one had a venue here. And the literary quarterlies like Partisan Review, like Midstream, like Dissent, they were mostly academic. They were not interested in these Beat Generation people. They really couldn't care less. So Roy said, let's have a magazine, and I said, sure. I knew everything about it. We had both helped Richard Hadlock when he put together the Record Changer, which was also a handmade magazine, but a little larger in format or whatever, and I think he had the type set. But other than that, there was no difference. When you do photo offset, it's a similar process. The first prototypes were those purple ink things. I ran across those a lot. But we were more advanced because we wanted to make something pretty. And I think I wouldn't have been satisfied with something that was so casual. I wanted it to have stature. When our plan was to make a real magazine that unfolded, that was stapled, that could hold its own. We paid to have 500 copies actually printed by an offset printer. Of course, then there were pages, and we had to put together the pages. Eventually, we had parties, and we had collating and stapling parties, and all our friends helped. First would come LeRoi and whoever else was not working at the time, and then people would begin to arrive after their day jobs. We would all just sit around and pass pages along and get progressively drunker on whatever we were drinking, usually ale. That was Roy's favorite drink, but then people would bring vodka and scotch and whatever. Sometime in there, we would cook a meal, but not only the women, and we always made something like spaghetti because the more spaghetti you have, you can stretch the sauce. And we would make food for whomever happened to arrive. There was the bottomless, it was like making stone soup, that little kid's story. Yeah. There was always something for everybody. We did one little pamphlet like that too, called January 1st, 1959 for Fidel Castro. We were so in love with Fidel Castro because like any good beat guy, he had a beard. The first issue was all poetry. But then we decided we had to publish prose because we had Hubert Selby Jr., who wrote Last Exit to Brooklyn, Cubby Selby, who was a good friend. The first issue was when we were still living in the village in the little 1.5 room, the semi-professional apartment I had rented. I didn't know what the semi meant. So we rented, this was called an IBM proportional space. You could set it so that actually you could justify the right margin. But it took typing something, maybe about 5 times over and over and over and over till you got the proportions right. A lot of people have asked, well, if you hadn't been doing, you certainly could have written if you hadn't been doing all these other things. But I'm not so sure. Because when I got good and ready, I did it because that's how I am. I don't have any regret that, I just think, well, I mean, how can you look back on your life that you are so thankful for and wish it any other way?
Artifacts is a free oral histories platform. Please like, subscribe, and visit our website, www.artifacts.movie, for an ad-free, interactive experience with bonus content. If you're able, please make a tax-deductible donation at www.artifacts.movie/donate. Hit the link on screen to watch another Artifacts interview.